Amachi camp guided by very young soldiers. One time, soldier stopped me and, "Hey, you wanna talk to me?" And he said, "Yeah. Are you a human being?" I said, "Yes. Don't you think so? Yeah, you look like a human being." But when I came from South Carolina, they said that the Jap is not a human being. They are like a gorilla. So if you want to kill them, that's what I learned in the camp.
They're gorillas. That's what Mutsuhoma learned about herself when she went to the camps. To most Americans, she wasn't even human anymore.
Jap is not a human being.
Mutsu was Japanese. It was 1942, just after the Japanese government bombed Pearl Harbor. Less than 3 months later, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The order allowed the government to round up over 100,000 people of Japanese descent from all over the West Coast and send them to military camps, where they lived for almost 4 years. The camps were remote, isolated, stretches of desert or grassland bulldozed over and then smeared with half-assembled rows of huts.
The room that we had, I mean, it was just a room, barrack, just one little barrack. It's just a room.
Often barbed wire enveloped the camps, and men carrying rifles watched the prisoners from high towers. And no matter where they went in the United States, it was very cold in the winter and very hot in the summer and dusty all the time.
They didn't heat the rooms. We froze to death the first winter, or not really to death, but then it felt like it. And then the rain would come in through that hole in the roof.
It was horrible. I could just sit down and cry.
But all of it, the camps, the order to round up a whole group of people based on their race, taking their possessions, their land, the massive open-air prisons, it was all legal. And if we don't learn from our history, we're bound to repeat it. I'm Salima Hamarani, and this is Making Contact. This year is the 75th anniversary of what we now call Japanese internment. And every year since 1942, Japanese Americans have tried to get the rest of us to remember what happened, to notice the scar internment left, not just on the Japanese community, but on all of us.
So my name is Satsuki Ina, a third-generation Japanese American. I was born in the Tule Lake Segregation Center in 1944, which was an American concentration camp during World War II.
Satsuki and her family spent most of the war incarcerated, and she uses the term concentration camp when speaking about what we usually refer to as internment.
There were many euphemisms used by the federal government to minimize the degree of injustice that the Japanese Americans suffered. In documents signed by President Roosevelt, he referred to them as concentration camps.
Today, Satsuki Ina is a psychotherapist and a documentarian. She was eager to talk about her story, which starts on December 7th, 1941. The day the Japanese military bombed Pearl Harbor and the United States government entered World War II.
This is John Daly speaking from the CBS newsroom in New York. The Japanese have attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and our defense facilities.
Once the military Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, it served as kind of a point at which government officials, military could mobilize around the idea of a enemy source living in the U.S.
Here at the Naval Air Station is grim and positive evidence of Jap treachery. Here, foul blows were struck.
Japanese Americans quickly became targets within days, hours of Pearl Harbor.
The Issei, first-generation Japanese who are not allowed to become citizens, who were leaders in the San Francisco Bay Area, they were being rounded up within hours after Pearl Harbor was bombed.
Racism against Asian immigrants existed long before Pearl Harbor. But Pearl Harbor definitely made that racism more intense.
It was just incredible, the feeling that that gave us.
This is a U.S. soldier named Joseph Arsenault.
Of hatred for anybody who would backstab us like this.
Explaining the anger and elation right after the attack.
You could cut the amount of hate that was in that room. You could cut it with a dull knife, and it was just unbelievable how high off the floor I felt.
And that high off the floor hatred made life difficult for Japanese Americans. Roy Ebihara was a boy at the time, living in Clovis, New Mexico. Right after Pearl Harbor, he was driven out of his home by an armed white gang in the middle of the night.
It must have been about 9 o'clock at night, and I just recall just crying and crying, just living in fear, and so that we all cried and cried as kids.
And so they were able to round up all the Japanese there, put them in these cars, and then you just...
We took off.
That was the first wave: name-calling, isolation, attacks. Then came laws which made all that racism legal. Did she have to go through a curfew here in San Francisco?
Yes, sure. And then people who had jobs that required that they be there after the curfew had to get special permits or were not allowed to be out on the streets. They had to stay in their homes.
There were curfews, permits, a kind of special registry, the firing of Japanese employees from government positions, the seizing of Japanese banks and businesses. All of this happened in less than 3 months, between Pearl Harbor and the exclusion order. And did people comply with these orders? Were people resisting the curfew or the attacks on their businesses?
There were certainly individuals who resisted and evaded the removal order. Fred Korematsu is one of them, and it's led to a Supreme Court case opposing the incarceration. But the National Japanese American Citizens League was the basic civic organization made up of Japanese Americans, encouraged the Japanese in the community to comply, to not resist, to show your loyalty by doing what the government was asking.
And then the government began rounding up people of Japanese ancestry and putting them into open-air prisons.
If you had 1/4 Japanese blood, you were removed from your homes on the West Coast. This included orphans, babies, children who were in orphanages in Southern California. They were removed from the orphanage and placed in the Manzanar concentration camp. So this was based on race.
People were actually rounded up.
Yes.
So they were rounded up. Like, did people come into the city one day and just take everybody out of their homes?
No, this was interesting. There were signs posted in the neighborhoods and radio announcement, newspaper announcements that if you were Japanese, alien, or what they called non-alien, which, you know, is an American citizen, right, were to report at these different stations where the Greyhound bus or the military trucks would come and load up the people. So they were told to be there at a certain time and a certain day.
On evacuation day, as it came to be known, thousands of Japanese lined up near trains or buses in designated areas all over the West Coast. They wore numbers on their coats and on their shirts. They held a suitcase, maybe two. The United States government had taken almost everything else that they owned. The War Relocation Authority, established in 1942, handled the details of their incarceration. The agency also produced propaganda about internment.
They are not prisoners. They are not internees. They are merely dislocated people, the unwounded casualties of war.
The videos painted a rosier picture of life in the camps. They were designed to soothe people's conscience.
The Army provided housing and plenty of healthful, nourishing food for all. We are setting a standard for the rest of the world in the treatment of people who may have loyalties to an enemy nation. We are protecting ourselves without violating the principles of Christian decency.
Compare that to how George Morihiro felt when he entered a camp for the first time.
There's some things in your heart that you can't forget, and that is the day you walk through that gate, you know you lost something. Because, you know, the gate's got guards and barbed wire fence and everything. and you're walking from a free life into a confined life. And I know one thing, it was hard to explain to somebody what was it like in camp, because we never tell them the truth what it was like in camp. It was horrible.
On evacuation day, Satsuki's parents were shipped from San Francisco to a temporary facility in San Bruno.
My mother was pregnant at that time, so they were housed in a horse stable that had been quickly transformed into human livable conditions. But she wrote in her diary that the smell of the manure was still there, and there was still evidence that horses had lived there before.
So they were basically living where the horses had been living,
yes,
in stables.
They were in stables, yeah.
The humiliation of being housed where animals once lived is a feeling Matsao Watanabe remembers clearly.
I had been to Puyallup a few times when it was the fairgrounds of western Washington. Little did I know that I would replace the pigs and the cows, and they had a hell of a lot of nerve calling it Camp Harmony.
This is a situation Satsuki's parents were in when government officials confronted them with the loyalty questionnaire,
asking them, even though they were American citizens, whether they would declare their loyalty to the U.S., stating that they would be willing to bear arms against the enemy and that they would forswear loyalty to the emperor. And they did have relatives in Japan. They answered no to the two questions, and they were then labeled as disloyal and shipped to the Tule Lake Segregation Center, which was the maximum security prison for Japanese Americans.
This whole experience, losing their home, being rounded up and forced into camps, having children while incarcerated, it scarred them.
By that time, they were in so much despair about what life in America was going to be for their children that they decided to renounce their American citizenship. They were a young couple in their 20s with a baby, experiencing this really horrific life experience as American citizens.
And they weren't alone. Officially, we've been taught that the Japanese did not protest. They went quietly into the camps. But in fact, many rebelled.
If I couldn't accept curfew, how could I accept this? As soon as that question hit me, I knew the answer. I can't accept it. It's worse. This is worse.
There were riots in the camps, strikes, demonstrations. Masses of prisoners renounced their U.S. citizenship. In Tule Lake and Manzanar, two concentration camps in California, guards shot prisoners during riots, but people continued to rebel. The mass imprisonment lasted through the end of the war. On January 2, 1945, the U.S. government released everyone. But Satsuki thinks that the Japanese American community is still suffering the impacts.
You can get out of the camps, but the camps don't get out of you, is how I see it. And the word trauma hadn't been applied to this experience until fairly recently, in the last 10 or 15 years. After my parents were released, the anxiety was worse because there was no protection for them. Employment was difficult. Housing, there was, in the San Francisco Bay Area, people wouldn't rent to Japanese. After the war, there was a lot of continued hatred towards the Japanese. So that went on for years. And I think 9/11, I think the growing current attitudes and fears about immigration and refugees and the traumas that are experienced in the African American community, all of these issues today have triggered for people in our Japanese American community the possibility that such a mass incarceration could happen again.
It's what moved so many Japanese Americans like Satsuki to participate in social movements.
We are working together to use the Japanese American experience as a symbol of the horrible mistake, the horrible blindness that hysteria can lead to. So we're taking what happened to us as a way of protesting and keeping America vigilant about what could happen